And last but not least, Andrew Jackson's Indian policy. So we want to just, again, do a quick recap on where we've been. We've seen a lot of wars. We've seen the Pequot Wars, which was very early on. We saw the Beaver Wars. You had different tribes fighting over control of trade. King Philip's War, 1675. Crucial fluency fact, make sure you go back and review that. The Pueblo Revolt, French and Indian War, and Pontiac's uprisings. Remember, that happens just as the French and Indian War is ending. We've got covenant chain. Please review that fluency fact as well. In the 1700s, you have the Plains Indians adopt the horse, and this is a total game changer. This is going to totally change the way that they live their daily lives. It's going to be really important going forward. We're going to see lots of expansion. Anytime you've got this westward movement by the white settlers, the Native Americans are going to be on the losing end of that battle. We did see some successes. We saw the Northwest Ordinance and several different intercourse acts, which say that treaties must be done with the government. It must have fair dealings. Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville. This is a huge loss of land, so 25,000 square miles. In terms of looking at the way the federal government has been solving things, Jefferson is advocating for assimilation. We have this continuity. So be thinking about continuity and change while we go through this. You just have this never-ending cycle: invasion, resistance, defeat, treaty, revoking the treaty, repeat. So remember that we get Louisiana, that doubles the size of the United States, but obviously there's a lot of Native Americans living in this region, so they're going to be coming into conflict. And you've got a lot of lateral migration that's happening after the War of 1812. So after our transportation is improving, as a result of the market revolution, there are a lot more opportunities for people to move west. So why does Andrew Jackson decide on removal? So he decides on a forced removal of the tribes. So more and more white settlers are pouring into these native lands. They're looking for land, specifically land to grow cotton. So they're going to be bringing slavery into these regions. And so they really want this land, so they're pressuring Congress. We've got these groups: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, among others, are being brought into conflict. Important to note that Jackson does have an Indian fighting past. He was known as Sharp Knife or Indian Killer, so he has a reputation for being quite brutal in battles with Native Americans. The Creeks at Horseshoe Bend will lose 22 million acres. Those are big parts of Alabama and Georgia. He's also involved in a lot of treaties that will remove a lot of land from Native Americans and not give them much in exchange. So it's important to note that these tribes are agreeing out of appeasement, that they think, okay, if we give them this amount of land, maybe they'll stop. But of course we know that that's not what happens. And like Jefferson, Jackson has some interesting contradictions. So despite this kind of awful decision he makes to forcibly remove these tribes, which ends in such high death rates, he does take in a Native American, a young boy, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So this was a boy whose family had been killed in the battle. He's laying in the arms of his mother, who has died. And so a soldier comes upon this baby and he brings him to Andrew Jackson and says, "What should we do?" And Andrew Jackson says, "Send him to Mrs. Jackson." So he adopts this boy, Lincoln. He dreams of him being a military strategist, of sending him to West Point, and that's definitely not what happens there. But he was a gifted writer, and he becomes a saddle maker. There's going to be several runaway attempts. Obviously, there was some assimilation there that Jackson thought would happen, and it just didn't. So this poor young man was really struggling with his cultural identity in the Jackson household, and he will end up dying of tuberculosis in 1828. All right, we've got a Supreme Court decision we need to know about in terms of Indian removal in 1823. So it says that Indians or Native Americans could occupy lands within the United States, but can't hold the title. So they can't have the deed. So they don't really have a legal leg to stand on there because their right of occupancy is subordinate or less than to the United States right of discovery. So they can occupy these lands, but they can't truly own them. So that's not good news for our tribes. So as a result, the tribes are just going to stop kind of dealing with the government. They're going to stop selling land to them. They just keep coming in and taking them with these new settlers pouring in anyway. So what is the point? Important to note that there is resistance to this. They're not just rolling over. And one way that they're resisting is kind of the idea, if you can't beat them, join them. And so you have quite a few tribes that start large scale farming and say, okay, we're going to do what these settlers are doing, and maybe they'll leave us alone. But it backfires because a lot of these tribes end up being far more successful than their white neighbors. So they begin to be resented by their new neighbors. Some are going to refuse to leave their land, so there will be wars that will be fought to remove them, specifically the Creeks and the Seminoles. They're going to be aided by fugitive slaves. And wow, what a thing to enrage the white planters to have Native Americans and fugitive slaves working together. Cherokee are going to try to use the legal system. They're going to set up their own constitutions, again, trying to model kind of after the white society. So they create a constitution in 1827, declaring them independent. State of Georgia thinks that's pretty cute, but they completely disagree. And they see them as squatters, so they're going to stick with that 1823 court decision that they cannot hold the title to any of these lands. It is important to note that many whites are on the side of the Native American groups. Davy Crockett was the most notable, so he had been a hero at the Alamo. All right, so what is Jackson's policy? His agenda is to move them out of the vicinity of the white population. So on one level, he's saying, I'm doing this to protect you. I'm moving you out of the way of these white settlers that are coming in. So again, remember that previous policy had been assimilation, not forcible removal. So you're going to see the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So try to memorize that if you can. The Cherokee are going to try to fight this using the legal system again. So we're going to have a series of cases here. This is a Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1831. And the judge rules that the Cherokee are a domestic dependent nation. And so he is going to ignore this court's ruling, because if they are a domestic dependent nation, then they have rights and they cannot be forced to move. And so Jackson just ignores it, which is an interesting tactic. This is going to culminate in the Trail of Tears in 1838. So again, this is the forced removal of all of these people from their homes that they have spent, decades and decades on these lands. Okay, and there is your card. And just to go back to this for one more second, the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. This is the Taney Court at this point in time. And Jackson very famously says that the court has made their decision, let's see them enforce it. So again, this is a pretty bold move by an executive. This is one that we don't tend to see from an executive in terms of viewing the court. So they are considered to be the highest law on the land, and he is really turning that upside down. So another way in which Jackson is changing the role of the executive.